Well, you just had a magnificent contemporary model of what Fred set forth. Thank you so much. I profited from that and found that so very, very helpful. Took a lot of good notes, and I hope you learned from that time. And Fred has been a good model to me for mentoring because I've seen the fruit of that in some men that he's mentored over the years. I'm so thankful for it. When you think about the Apostle Paul's process of mentoring, we certainly see it in the pastorals, see that with Timothy and Titus. He latched hold of those boys and taught them and trained them and poured his life into them and continually reiterated to them living in the glory of the gospel of Christ, living in this risen Christ. And so here was this relationship. There's a passage in Acts chapter 20 that just strikes me. You know the way that Luke deals with things in the book of Acts. He's got a few main characters that he talks about. And so some of the apostles we don't even see anymore after you get past chapter 1. We don't see their names mentioned. Apostles generically is mentioned, but we don't see their names. We primarily see Peter, a little bit of John, not really a whole lot of John, the early part, but a few points, primarily Peter, and as Brian was pointing out last night. Then you get to chapter 13, and you see Paul and Barnabas and then Silas later on. So those are main characters. So if Luke brings up someone, he's jumping up and down and calling our attention to it. That's the way I view, as I read through this very limited history of the early church, compressed together in those chapters. So chapter 20, after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Now, I'll pause right here. We don't see everyone necessarily that was accompanying Paul on his missionary journeys. So we get to Acts 16 and we see Luke mentioning we. Who all was tagging along with that? We know about Silas, we know about Timothy, we know Luke came into the focus at that point. But what I would submit to you is that there were points along the way where local churches, where Paul had been ministering and had laid groundwork and had begun to mentor guys, and then those guys were mentored in their churches, and they sent them later to go with Paul. So, key point, verse 4. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us. Here Luke comes back into the scene, waiting for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. And then they go on with Paul later on to Jerusalem. So what we see happening here is that Paul had a number, and we could say a sphere of young men that were involved in his life in ministry, that he involved themselves in them, teaching them, training them, setting an example for them, and they learned ministry from him. Some of the guys that do all the research on this say that there are about 40, maybe a little over 40 people that are mentioned that had a tie with Paul. They were involved with his life that we find in the New Testament. So out of that 40, how many of those did Paul mentor? We'd probably say all of them to some degree, but some of them he mentored with more depth, so much so that he could leave Silas, and he could leave Timothy, and he could leave Luke to continue ministry in places along the way. And that is good, effective mentoring. Now, what I like to do in this session is just talk about some contemporary models for mentoring. In the book that you were given, I have 4 models, and I'm not going to be using any of those because I figure you can read those for yourself. And those models I think would be very helpful. What I'm giving you today will be different than those 4 models. And it's important for us to see there is a variety of different models. So your practice of mentoring may not look exactly like Fred Malone's. As a matter of fact, if it's exactly like Fred Malone's, I'm going to tell you, you're just being a copycat and you're not taking time enough to think through about your local setting and your gifts. He's got unique gifts that enable him where he is, what he's doing. So learn from him, maybe follow that model. Don't follow it to a T unless you're a Fred Malone clone. That's not a bad idea. Fred would object to that. Debbie wouldn't object to that, but Fred wouldn't object to that. Fred would object to that. But I think this is where all of us need to learn from others. We need to pay attention. We need to be continually refined in the way we approach mentoring. Because, we go to a mentoring conference, we read books on mentoring, we talk to people about it, and we say, I know how to do all this. Well, you know how to start it. And you know how to do some of it. But with every person that comes in, and we saw this with Fred's discussion on it, with every person that comes in that you're mentoring, you see something else, and you get sharpened here, and you get sharpened there, and so you make a tweak here and an adjustment there, and so your mentoring 10 years ago doesn't look the same way it does right now. There may be a lot of similarities, but there are differences. So we want to be growing in this area, and one of the ways we do that is by regularly taking a look at models. Well, when I was a college junior, the dean of the college, a small Baptist college in Mobile, saw me in the hallway one day, and he invited me into his office. And that's very dangerous. I didn't know what was going on. But he asked me if I'd be interested in doing an internship at a church in the area, and I would receive through this, I've received 3 hours credit toward my religion major. Well, that sounded like a good deal to me. I was eager to serve in a church. I had served in one church for a short period of time, and to say that I was not mentored would be putting it mildly. I was mentored in what not to do in ministry. And I didn't, seriously, the only thing I learned from the pastor was what not to do by thinking, I don't want to be like this guy in the least bit. And, that's not a good thing for a 19-year-old ministry student. Well, I expressed my interest. I started to get familiar with this church and the possibilities, and it ended up being one of the most significant, life-changing experiences of my life. But here's the odd twist to it at this stage. The pastor was gracious to me. He gave me lots of opportunities to teach and preach. As a matter of fact, there were quite a few times, either on Saturday night or Sunday morning, he asked me if I wanted to preach Sunday night. And he was an undisciplined man. He was so kind to me, and I appreciated him so much. And he showed me, some of the odd and end ropes in church life, but he didn't mentor me spiritually, theologically, missiologically, pastorally, preaching. He didn't mentor me in any of those things. He was a friend, he was helpful, but he did not do anything intentionally toward helping to really get me ready for pastoral ministry. Now, that's not to say I didn't learn anything from him, because I did. I did learn a few things not to do, but I did learn a few things along the way. But here's the thing that happened to me. The congregation, at least a portion of them, even though they did not realize it, they were shaping me for future ministry. So it was in that setting that I began to learn the effects of the congregation along with pastors in mentoring for ministry. It just happened at that juncture that the congregation had far more influence on me than the pastor did. And I'm thankful that at that time I had some outside influence, like Brian was talking about, that was helping to mentor me along the way. One was a pastor in the community, another was a professor, and then from my friends, as we banded together as a band of brothers committed to preach Christ, and all that was helping to mentor and shape me. But it was through that congregation that I began to learn things with them. Relationships were built, pastoral skills were developed over that 2-year period or so that I was with them that are still with me 40 years later. And the involvement that I had in discipling, shepherding, teaching, ministering together prepared me to serve as a pastor. And I had the opportunity a couple of years ago, I believe it was, to go back for this church's 150th anniversary. I think it was 100th, 150. It was a lot of years. Maybe it's 100th. No, it's 150 because it was back in the 19th century when the church was started. And to be around those folks and to see how the Lord's continuing to work in some of their lives, not all of them, but in some of their lives, I'm just staggered. I was a college student. I didn't know my head from a hole in the ground. But I guess my head from a hole in the ground was a little step above their heads from holes in grounds. And so, I taught them, trained them, did it the best I could to disciple them, and they're following after Christ today. Now, I tell you that because what I want to help you to do is to think broadly and narrowly about mentoring. There's not one correct way to mentor. So if you're stuck in some mode and you think, this is the only way to do it, brother, throw that out the window. That's arrogance, because every person you mentor is going to be different than the other one that you mentored. Just like I have 5 children. I can't raise all, well, they're all grown now, but I couldn't raise all of my 5 children the exact same way. They got different personalities, different interests, different bents. You're going to see that with your pastoral interns. And so that's important. So personalities differ, ministry students vary, gifts and countless circumstances are going to be different. And so to put mentoring in a box and to think that it has to be this way or no other way is going to be problematic. There are going to have to be adjustments. So as we consider some contemporary models, I want you to think broadly. What you have in mind at present for establishing a mentorship or what you're doing right now may fit very well, may fit in a wonderful way right now, but it may not. And you really need to be willing to make changes to learn from what you've done well and to learn from what you've not done as well. And learn from others, be able to make changes. So think broadly, but I also want you to think narrowly. And by that I mean, take the time to put some specific ideas together, pray through those ideas, research them, evaluate them, discuss them with your fellow elders and pastors, discuss them with potential pastoral interns and trainees. I mean, you have to think about, why do I want to start a mentoring ministry? Because as Fred pointed out, it is time consuming. It involves a lot of life. It involves you pouring your life into someone else. It involves you becoming vulnerable so that the intern understands you're not the guy that has arrived. You're still in the process. And you open your life up enough to them to see that. And so you want to think, am I laying groundwork for future elders and leaders in our church? Am I training up to send out church planners and pastors and missionaries and church leaders for other churches? Am I simply discipling my own people? Am I just trying to strengthen the health of the church? Or maybe all of the above? Well, all those things are worthy and they're good, and that has an effect on how you do your internship. And so you're mentoring, you narrow it down. And I would say investigate some of the contemporary mentoring practices that may be going on in your area or maybe somewhere near you. It's really surprising how many churches have some type of internship, mentorship, or ministry leadership training going on. And some of them may be fabulous. Some of them may not be so good, but learn from them. Ask questions. I continually do that. I'm always asking guys, tell me how you're training others. I want to know that. Read their material. Visualize what they're doing in terms of what you are doing and seeing, is there something I can learn here and put into practice? Above all, as you seek the Lord about mentoring, take action to develop a model that fits you, that fits your gifts, that fits your congregation, that fits the gifts of those who are assisting you, that fits those that you are trying to mentor, and then I would say that fits even your geographical region, your point of ministry. Think on all these things. So in other words, don't go to a Christian bookstore, buy a mentorship box and unwrap it and think this is going to suffice for your church. It probably won't. And so this is where we have to show leadership and how the Lord shapes each congregation so that we might be faithful in training others. And so with that in mind, I want to try to give you 3 contemporary models for mentoring. The first is the Journey Church in Westchester, Pennsylvania. It's important, and this is what I see took place at the Journey Church. It's important that we pay attention to the unique circumstances that God has given to us and placed us in when we're planning pastoral internships. Rather than a one-size-fits-all, it may be that your particular setting has some possibilities, and they're great possibilities, and they're just sitting under your nose. And so you want to take the time to pray and observe. I think our mentorship ought to be driven by the teaching of Scripture and the Holy Spirit urging us forward. Meditate on what's going on around you. Consider it. Ask questions. Think about it. Take advantage of the gifts that the Lord has given you to enable you to train the next generation. Now, when my friend, and Fred knows Raymond Johnson, who's the pastor of the Journey Church, when he received the call to this church about 4 years ago, this church in Westchester, right outside of Philadelphia, he began to notice some unique possibilities that God had given the church. The facility that housed this church was built over a century ago, and it was built by another denomination, and it had far more space in it than the church was utilizing when they arrived. There was an SBC group that purchased the building for a song and a dance. Well, it's a Baptist, so maybe they didn't dance a whole lot, but maybe a little bit. In order to get the building, they would have danced. And they got it for a great price, and they moved it to start a church plant in this very historic old community right outside of Philly. And the church is literally right downtown. You walk out the door, and here's the town. So when Raymond received the church's call, he'd finished his MDiv at Southern Seminary. He was working on his PhD in theology there, and he didn't come to a healthy church. But it was a church that had divisions. They had staff trouble. They had a former staff member still in the church that was creating an undercurrent. They had instability in membership. They had a lack of polity. And they had outside interference from a former pastor. Sounds like just a place you want to go. Yet, God was raising up a good core group that demonstrated hunger for the Word and a desire for growth in grace and a heart to reach that community with the gospel. And I really think his perseverance and his teachable spirit in pastoring has helped to move the church toward a better health. Now, one interesting thing that took place, after Raymond got there, he had a friend that worked for the North American Mission Board, or did at the time, and he was discussing with him about what was going on, and he asked him about assisting with an internship program. They pushed the button and did it. And the North American Mission Board agreed to provide a stipend of $6,000 a year for each of 4 interns for 2 years. And so because the building had all this rambling space with a little bit of augmentation, they were able to provide small living quarters for 3 of the 4 interns, and one of those interns has a spouse, so they have a little small apartment for this intern and spouse. And in exchange for the housing and the stipend, the interns began a 2-year journey, and they're still in it. They're close to the end of that, under Raymond's leadership in preparation for future ministry. They were committed to full-time work with the internship along with church responsibilities. In a sense, they've served as a multi-staff of sorts with Raymond as the single paid pastor on staff. I spent a weekend with them back a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago now, and had the opportunity to observe the gifts and the practices of the interns, had good interaction with them. Raymond makes a point of bringing in others. Tom Nettles has been there, Timothy George, Gavin Ortland, and others, and they come in, and there's a lot of good interaction going on. Now, what Raymond did, he provided me with syllabuses of 5 semesters of pastoral internship requirements, and I must admit, I saw somewhere in that the stamp in wax of Fred Malone, because a dear brother that Fred mentored was a member there, and he helped Raymond along the way. And as I read through this, I thought, I can see this brother's stamp, and I know where that came from. And so you see this really sort of a grandfather, great-grandfather effect in mentoring that's going on. So Raymond gave me these syllabuses. They would rival anything you would see in a theological seminary. Each one covers a major discipline involving substantial reading and writing components. And for instance, one on spiritual disciplines required reading devotionally through the New Testament during the semester, accompanied with reading Packer's Knowing God, portions of Calvin's Institutes, Bolton's The True Bounds of Christian Freedom, and other writing with about 11,400 words in 8 papers that were required of them. And all the while, they would get together, interact, discuss stuff, meet regularly with Raymond, and they would hold down responsibilities to assist with the church. And so the coursework over the 2-year span includes New Testament, systematic theology, Christian preaching, biblical counseling, hermeneutics, and spiritual disciplines. Interns that have successfully completed that and gone through this process, because Raymond has worked this out with a seminary, they're able to get some pretty substantial seminary credit. But he worked that out with them ahead of time, and as I looked through the requirements, I thought, yeah, they should get some seminary credit because this is master's level work that he's requiring of them. So while they're doing this, the interns are participating fully in the church's ministry. So it's not like they're going to classes, doing their thing on the work, and then going home. They're involved in everything that goes on. And so they're there from 9 to 5, Tuesdays through Thursdays, all day Sunday. They assist with phone calls and messages. They handle benevolent cases. They prepare rooms for meetings. I'm sure they've cleaned a few toilets while they've been there. I mean, that to me, unless you've learned how to do that, you have not trained a guy for pastoral ministry very well. They meet with members. They participate in the church's small group. They follow up on guests. They lead Bible studies. They work on preparing for the Sunday service details and other aspects for the ministry. As one of my former pastors put it, Raymond shows them the glamour of the pulpit. And they really begin to see all these other things that you do beside preaching. And so what he does, he gives them a chance to taste the full range of pastoral ministry and the 1,001 details that go with it and the weekly surprises that happen in ministry. You never know what a week's going to bring forth, and that's been the case with them. They walk through a number of difficulties, some disciplinary issues, some things that are just downright quagmires. You wonder, how in the world are they going to get through this? How are they going to get through this personality stuff? And these interns are there in the middle of it. As Brian was talking about last night, as guys got started with him, before his church was revitalized, they were right in the middle of all the junk going on. And so these interns are there, and they're seeing that. And then he's pressing into their lives. You just have to deal with them about their souls, their walk with Christ. So how is he able to handle 4 interns at this pace? He's sort of like the ever-ready bunny, and he doesn't stop. So he's got enormous energy. He's well organized. He's got his internship clearly laid out so that the interns know exactly what's expected of them. They've got very clear deadlines that they have to meet those deadlines. He's got a good educational background to teach at a high level, and he includes them in the breadth of the church's ministry so that they feel like they're really a part of the ministry. And he's built very strong relationships with them. Raymond and his family live in a wing on a second or third floor in one of the church buildings. And so essentially these interns are living with Raymond and his family. They're in the same building. They see each other all the time. And so what is happening there, he's building these strong relationships with them so that there is what one writer calls the witness in mentoring. And so there's that witness going on. We're just with you. And as you do that, you begin to catch things. So is the Journey Church's pastoral internship something that you might consider? I think that's where you take a good look around. You need to think about your gifts, and you need to think about your schedule, and you need to think about your family, and you need to think about the partnerships in your church of those that can serve with you. You need to think about your finances and what's available. You need to think about facilities. You need to think about relationship with the seminary. You need to think about your energy level. And so you might find that the level that Raymond is operating on fits you perfectly. You go for it. You might find it's a bit too much. So take some of those ideas, perhaps, and pare them down. Maybe instead of doing separate semesters or that same level of seminary-style training, you realize that's not your strength. And so you narrow down. Or you don't have access to the funds. You're having to do this on a no-cost basis. Then you work within that kind of framework. And so I would encourage you, think about what Providence has done in your life. Think about what Providence has laid at your doorstep, and let that perhaps begin to shape what you're doing in your mentoring. And whatever you do, do it with excellence and with diligence. Our second model is Grace Church in Memphis. After walking through the experience of being summarily dismissed from his student pastor position at a church in the Memphis area, Jordan Thomas began to seek the Lord about the next step that he was going to take. The church he was serving in reacted to his gospel convictions, particularly the doctrines of grace. He understood that theology and methodology are married. They're not separate partners. And so that was going into his student ministry. And so there was a strong reaction, and because of that, there were some that removed him. And thankfully, it didn't dampen Jordan's passion for gospel ministry. So after seeking the Lord, he and his wife Tracy moved to Minneapolis, and he became the first church planting resident for Bethlehem Baptist Church. So after a few years of training and retooling, Jordan returned to Memphis in 2006 to plant Grace Church in the downtown area near the riverfront. If you're familiar with the downtown area of the riverfront, you know this is true urban life. And this is urban Memphis. Well, Jordan partnered with 2 longtime friends, Nathan Sawyer and Brian Smith. Nathan is the primary guy that coordinates and heads up their pastoral internship. Bethlehem Baptist held them accountable. They helped them financially. I think to this day, and that he came down in 2006, to this day, they still have regular contact with them, regular meetings with them, conversations with them, annual retreat with them. So they're very involved in helping them while having turned them loose in their work. The church was established with covenant membership in 2007, and from that point, they began to do this ministry in the inner city. Along the way, Grace Church established a pastoral internship to train up their members for leadership in the church, and some with the potential for pastoring and church planning, church revitalization, and mission work. They're very, very heavily involved in international missions, as well as what they're doing in their work in Memphis. And so while they agree that there are other organizations that can help out in training for ministry, they believe the local church cannot take second place when it comes to training. We need more of that, brothers. This is what they write. We believe that the local church is primarily responsible to identify, equip, and send those whom the Lord is setting apart for gospel ministry. Our conviction, though, is that the essential preparation and development for pastoral ministry happens best in the context of the local church under the care and oversight of her elders, with the church providing the final affirmation and blessing. Very similar to what Brian was describing last night, very similar to what Fred was talking about. The local church is involved in it, is under the authority and the work of the elders and pastors in the church, and the church is to have that final affirmation and blessing. So at the start, you recognize that Grace Church sets this priority on the local church training up leaders, and as they write, that they might remain at Grace for a lifetime, making many disciples. They hope that out of this training, and it has already happened like this, that some of the men that they train up will become elders in the church. And I've gotten to know some of them that are, who have been trained through them. They also pray that they'll have opportunity to be involved in sending out some of those men as Christian workers in other churches and in doing cross-cultural settings. They base their mentoring and their internship on a 4-year process. So it's a 4-year vision. And I would say what they do can be replicated in most any church. They don't compensate their pastoral interns. Maybe they're shouting on that. Yes, so there's no compensation. They require about 12 to 15 hours per week for internship involvement. That doesn't mean necessarily where they gather, because they're renting space. They don't have their own building. They do give them some books along the way. They send them to a weekender at Capitol Hill Baptist, and they'll try to help defray some of those expenses. But the guys know up front, you're on your own in paying for this to go to D.C. And so most of the expense for the pastoral internship is on the pastoral interns themselves. So here's how they sketch out their 4 years. Year 1 is church membership. They put it like this in their brochure on internship. In a sense, the entire church is in the internship program. I like that. And by that, they mean that the involvement of the body is happening in raising up and training and shaping those that will eventually serve in leadership and be sent out. They said, for this reason, the first year of the internship is fully involved faithful church membership at Grace Church. They don't think in their setting that anyone would fit well into the training program apart from membership in the church. They're willing to consider an exception in their application, but they state in their material on this, the best preparation for usefulness in the Lord's work is growth in personal holiness as a faithful church member. The membership year prerequisite is born out of our conviction that the entire church is the teacher in the internship, and those who enter her path of training ought know and be known by the entire body. So they just focused first year. We want you to be like Christ. We want you to look like Christ. We want you to live like Christ. And then out of that, the congregation is watching a brother here and a brother there that has an interest in pastoral internship to see, is this someone that's growing in Christ's likeness, or they just have the ambition, I want to be in ministry, and let's go ahead and get this thing underway. They want to see, are they growing in the grace and knowledge of Christ? Years 2 and 3 is what they call church internship. These 2 years are broken down into 4 terms each year, and they emphasize year 2 and 3, heart and head. is the conviction that the future pastor or elder or leader must have a good walk with Christ, faithfulness in marriage and family, and service to the body, and that takes precedence over the X's and O's of pastoral ministry. Without faithfully developing as a disciple of Christ, a man has no place in ministry. And so this is where they're seeing a man's teachability, his humility, his pursuit of Christ. They're looking at that. They're focusing upon that. They're pressing that in the lives of these men. During the 8 sessions in this 2-year period, the pastoral interns focus on personal, pastoral, and theological growth. That happens by teaching times, reading, interaction, accountability regarding communion with God, personal holiness, personal accountability, and developing patterns for healthy, sustainable growth in grace. The pastoral growth looks at how intense growth or rather how the interns are intensifying their growth personally and how they are shepherding their families. And so the elders are regularly just watching their lives. What are these guys doing? How do they treat their wife? And I'm so thankful Fred was right on target. If a man doesn't make his relationship with his wife a priority, then everything else is out of whack. And so they're looking at this, and knowing Jordan and Nathan and Brian, they seek to set an example in this in their own lives. Theologically, the program is building on the storyline of Scripture, and they're giving consideration to the major doctrines of the Word. Their aim, they say, is to see men grasp and articulate solid biblical theology. And all the while, they're showing how that solid biblical theology applies to life as they're watching the way that Grace Church's elders are shepherding the flock. So exactly what Fred was talking about, this application of doctrine to life and ministry. And it's being exemplified, and these guys are watching it. So during this time, they'll read books like Horatius Bonar's Words to Winners of Souls, Tozier's Knowledge of the Holy, John Owen, Communion with God, Ted Tripp, Shepherding a Child's Heart, Bruce Shelley, Church History in Plain Language, John Murray's Redemption Accomplished and Applied, Paul Tripp's Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands, John Owen, Overcoming Sin and Temptation, Grudem's Systematic Theology, and Graham Goldsworthy, According to Plan, and other works. They have them reading a lot and interacting. Then you get to year 4. They call this church residency. So you got church membership, church internship, years 2 and 3, and year 4, church residency. So after completing those 3 years, the elders give consideration. There's no guarantee it's going to happen, but they give consideration to offering a 4th year of church residency. They put it like this: this focuses more on the residents' hands. They've been focusing on head and heart. Now they want to focus on hands. And so by that they mean they want the residents to be involved in more areas of service along with the watchful eyes of the church's elders as well as the broader congregation. So they continue reading assignments and summaries of their reading and reviews of their reading. And this pastoral component, though, is looking at the many different angles and needs that come up in pastoral ministry. They participate in elders' meetings. They participate in the church's membership interviews. So they're learning about, as they put it, soul care opportunities as a way to gain gospel ministry exposure. They call this come and see opportunities. So they want these guys involved in what's going on. Now, because this church is in my area, I've gotten to know a number of their pastoral interns. I probably met most of them in their pastoral residence. And we've also partnered with them because Grace Church doesn't have a Sunday evening service. They've been gypsies and meeting in different places. And so we've actually set up some time for them to preach at Southwoods, and we try to make a big deal of it so our folks who come and Grace Church folks come. And some of these guys will preach at Southwoods, and not only will their elders interact with them, but some of us will interact with these guys as well. I watched them grow in their walks with the Lord. I've watched these guys grow in their love for the church. I've watched them improve in their preaching, and I've witnessed humble hearts and their willingness to serve others, and it's impressed me. Two of those men recently left Grace Church to go to Southeastern Seminary because both of them wanted to study biblical language. They'd been studying Greek, and they wanted to go where they could get Greek more intensely and study Hebrew as well. And they planned to return to Grace Church. I've talked with both of them. Both of them said they plan to return to Grace Church, and one of them wants to be involved in planting a church in Oklahoma, and another one of the residents plans to go with him, and another wants to be involved in church planting internationally. So here's what you need to follow their template. One, and I think this is maybe one of the most important things, what we do in mentoring, and that is try to have a healthy church. Concentrate on developing a healthy church that engages, in which the congregation is engaged in loving Christ and loving one another. So that healthy church begins to rub off on those men. Second, carve out time as pastors and elders to meet during the year, during the semester with each pastoral intern. Third, provide a good syllabus of materials and writing assignments. And those materials will help shape the devotional life, growth in holiness and grace, church consciousness, pastoral work, preaching, theology, missions. We can just keep going on and on. Fourth, bring the pastoral interns into your lives as congregation and leadership. This is sounding like a broken record, and it's a good broken record. Bring them into your lives. You can't treat that just like a typical, Sam, you appreciate me using that term, a typical seminary where a guy just goes to class from 8 to noon and he goes home and he's not involved. No, there's this involvement in life. Fifth, let the life of the congregation rub off on the interns so that they come to understand and appreciate healthy church life. So there's a lot of shoulder rubbing. There's a lot of engagement. These guys are involved in all the ministries of the church. And then 6, give them opportunities to serve, minister, teach, lead, and preach while you reinforce them and critique them throughout. All right. The third model, I'm going to just talk about what we've done some over the years at Southwoods Baptist in Memphis. And rather than going into too many details on that, I just want to give you some examples about how our approach to pastoral internship or mentoring at Southwoods has varied over the years. And maybe through that it just tweaks some ideas that you already have and maybe give you some thoughts of some other ways that you can be involved in mentoring. We've not always done it the same way. Several things affect the way that we approach whatever we're currently doing with mentoring. One is the season of life. I'm in a particular season of life. I want to make hay while the sun's still shining, and so I'm looking at things from that angle. You look at the prospective trainees that we have. Are all of these guys that have the potential to pastor a church? No. Do some of them have the potential of being elders in the church? Yes. Do some of them have potential of being pastors and missionaries? Yes. Do some of them just have the potential to be a good, healthy church member that will serve in the body? Yes. And so we consider that. Where are these trainees in their stage of life, in their plans for ministry? Have they received any kind of training? Have they received any kind of education? Sometimes, probably most of the time, we've learned that there is some untraining that has to take place with the pastoral interns. And Fred alluded to that earlier. But there are things that guys have in their mind, and they're just not healthy practices, either personally or pastorally or ecclesiologically. And so you're working through in redoing those. Do we have any financial resources? Usually the answer to that is no. What is my preaching and teaching schedules? Because I have to think about my calendar, the church's calendar, what we're doing, how we can be involved. So all of those are things to consider, and I will be pondering that over the next few weeks as we prepare for the fall and get cranked up again with our internship. We're still doing it some this summer, and we'll take August off, and that'll give some prep time. So, for instance, for several summers, we have the finances to support one pastoral intern full-time for the summer in between school breaks. We provided living space, some meals with one of our elders and his family, the intern to live with him, and a small stipend. It was a decent stipend for a kid in between school. And as it turned out, one of these guys did 2 summers in a row. It's sort of the same experience that Fred had. We'll start this, and as it turned out, we brought him back. I wish we had brought him back for the 3rd summer. We had someone else that didn't pan out quite as well. We had this young man, and so my associate pastor at the time and I, along with our elders, put him to work in all kinds of things. He helped with our student work. He attended youth camp. He was a counselor there. He helped with Vacation Bible School. He taught in Sunday school. He assisted with some clerical and office work. I'm sure he cleaned a few toilets along the way. He got involved in pastoral work. He was involved in visiting hospitals. He would be around if there were any weddings or deaths. He was involved in that. During that first summer, he preached 3 times on Sunday evenings, and he also had some reading and writing assignments, and we had countless discussions on Scripture, ministry, theology, practice, preaching. The second summer, he continued with similar duties, but he preached 10 consecutive Sunday evenings through Ephesians. By the way, he was a single man. He preached one of the best sermons on marriage in Ephesians 5 that I've ever heard anyone preach. So when he asked me to participate in his wedding, his dad's a pastor, so his dad conducted it, and I just assisted. I said, yes, under one condition, that you and your fiancé would go back and listen to the sermon you preached. He said, no, don't do that to me. I said, yes, I want you both to listen to it. And they did. He went on, finished his education. He's a very, very bright young man. He planted a church in Nashville about, I think, 6 or 7 years ago that's thriving. They're having a real impact in between Vanderbilt and Belmont College, meeting in temporary space, and they're discipling people that will be sent out all over the world. Now, in this case, finances, unmarried trainees, and schedule dictated a model that worked very well during those summers. On other occasions, we've had more limited finances with men that were married, had families, holding down jobs in the community. And so for them, we designed the training to maximize time for learning details in ministry and working on their preaching gifts. Due to the competition with their day job, we had to recognize their limitations. And so we tried to commandeer as much ministry time as we could. So with one of them, after a period of time, he was an older brother, we set up a preaching schedule for him to do 10 weeks in a row on Sunday evening, similar to what we did with this other young man. Well, he was bivocational, so it presented a pretty good challenge for him. So still remember one Sunday, I think it was one Sunday night, he came up to me and said, hey, bro, I've been doing this for 3 weeks now. Do you think maybe you could preach next Sunday night and I could take that off? I said, no. You need 10 weeks in a row, because what you've got to learn, if you're going to pastor one day, Sunday comes every week. It does not stop, and you got to be ready for that. And so he kind of hung his head for a little bit, and he did it though, finished the 10 weeks, and he's actually pastoring bivocationally right now. And so that was a very helpful lesson for him to learn, that Sundays do keep coming and you have to be ready. With 2 more young men, both attending seminary, both married, both working other part-time jobs, we adjusted the schedule to include these guys in-house, spending some time in the office with us. They were both members of our church. We had them in on Wednesdays. I think it was Wednesday afternoons because they had seminary classes in the morning. We provided a very modest stipend just to help them. We had some funds requisitioned. They team taught our students on Wednesday nights. They filled in with other classes. They did pastoral visits. They rewrote our wedding policy manual and did a great job with it. They worked on reworking some issues with our polity manual. We gave them some hints, and they worked at it. And then they shared the pulpit on Sunday evenings. One of these young men, after being with us for a couple of years of training, received a call from a church in our community that was in desperate need of revitalization. I went over and visited with him shortly after he went there as a pastor. And as a man in his late 50s at the time, I would have fit well into the youth group. This church had a lot of older people. And so we talked through a lot of the issues that he was going to be facing. And he has faced them. And he's done an extraordinary job, and this is going into 7 years now, almost 7 years. They've seen a lot of revitalization take place. They've established plural elder leadership in the church, and this is a very traditional SBC church that had a very traditional past, doing all the very traditional things SBC churches would do. So this was a major achievement, and they've increased their gospel ministry. They're actually sitting in between the two campuses of the University of Memphis. And so they've got a wonderful opportunity to minister to college students. The other young man who partnered with him came to our church about 11 years ago. After he had gone through this pastoral internship, this more intense program with this brother, he was called by our church to become assistant pastor. And today that title's changed to associate pastor, and he shares a lot of the preaching load and ministry load with me. There was another young man that earlier we had mentored. He planned on going on the mission field, and so we geared the mentorship toward missiological reading and thinking. And as it turned out, they had some physical issues that kept them from doing international work. One of our leaders on the field at the time desperately wanted them, and it didn't work out. But that man is now part of our staff as in a part-time capacity, and so both of them have been serving with our church for over 6 years. I had the second guy I've been mentoring for about 15 years, the other for 11 years, and so as one of my mom's friends puts it, if I flop up and die this week, I feel really good about the future of the church because these young men are well-trained, they're thoughtful, they're biblical, they've got great theological minds. So at present, we have 8 men participating in our pastoral internships. Not all of them will eventually serve as pastors in churches. Some, by God's grace, I think will continue serving with us and will show leadership in the church. Some, we believe, will be elders among us. All of them are married. All of them, except one, has children. They all have jobs in the community. Their schedules are all over the map, so we've had to make some changes to accommodate. So what we do for the present, we're meeting bi-monthly rather than, or monthly rather than bi-monthly. I think it's certainly more ideal with guys with that kind of schedule if we can meet bi-monthly, but it just hasn't worked out. So we rotate meeting times, sometimes Sunday afternoons, sometimes during a weeknight. Right now we're reading 2 books on preaching. We're discussing them. We're trying to make application on preaching and teaching. And the guys have been scheduled and have been preaching on Sunday nights. That we pretty much use our Sunday nights for training. And so these guys have been rotating through. They preach through the Sermon on the Mount. They've just recently finished up the Upper Room Discourse. One of the other pastors arrived, one of our elders will try to talk with them prior to their preaching, and then we try to talk with them afterwards to give them critique, try to strengthen them. Meanwhile, what we're doing in our meetings right now that I'm just having an absolute blast with, we're doing homiletics together. And so we come in, we work through a text, work through understanding the text, and then we're wrestling with its meaning. We're developing a theme. We're developing some kind of structure for expounding it. And so I'm listening to their ideas, and I'm pushing back on them. Why do you do that? Is that really in the text, or is that something you want to bring into it? And so it's just hands-on around the table. And the guys are helping each other along the way in doing that. And they've all said, let's keep doing this. I mean, they love the process. We try to loop these brothers into various pastoral opportunities. Some are teaching in the church. Some are teaching maybe a class here or there. We try to utilize them in service and leadership. We try to encourage them to participate and help finance them in short-term missions. We try to involve them in the larger ministry work of the church. We like the hands-on approach toward ministry. So over the years, we've looked at, in our discussions, we've looked at doing funerals and weddings, hospital visits, handling church discipline. Sometimes we've been in the midst of those. Establishing polity changes, church revitalization, church planting, developing a mission heart in a church. One of our guys served with the IMB in a hard-to-get-to country, and he and I spent a whole semester together just talking about church planting in that particular country and gearing it toward the people group that he was going to. We looked at the basics of church health. We look at hermeneutics. We look at homiletics. We look at pastoral counseling, and all the while, we're talking about theology and its integration. Sometime I will present them with some big problem that another church is dealing with or that our church has dealt with in the past, and I just lay it out and say, okay, let's talk about it. How are you going to deal with that? And that has become one of the most profitable teaching times for those guys because it gives me the opportunity to see, do you understand Scripture? Do you understand how your theology works into this setting? And it gives me a chance to punch holes in what they're thinking or to commend them or to give them a little better direction so that they come to some good, strong biblical conclusions. And so we're very interactive rather than approaching this through a lecture format. So Lord willing, we'll start a new round of pastoral training in the fall. And prior to that, I'm going to be doing some thinking through and planning and things I've learned here, things I've been listening to, things I've been reading, input from those guys, and make some changes as we go into the fall. One size doesn't fit all. And so I don't expect what we're doing in the fall to look like what we've been doing in the spring. We've learned from the past, and we want to keep learning. So any questions you want to ask about any of these? Yes?
I have a question on mentorship and evangelism. Talk about having our mentees have preaching and teaching opportunities and serving others. What about evangelism, especially outside the church?
A lot of that happens, I mean, some happens on short-term missions. Some of that happens with the guys in some of their own interactions. It's more the normal stride of life instead of setting up a time to say we're going to go out and evangelize. Now, Al Jackson in Auburn at Lakewood Baptist in Auburn, Lakeview, thank you. I always get it mixed up. At Lakeview in Auburn, takes his guys to campus and they go out and pass out tracts and evangelize. Some of these guys will actually just get together themselves and do that. Anything else? All right.